Hey, welcome back to the blog and the YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about how to set up and run a podcast. So essentially when it comes to podcasting, there are so many options for everything. You can host your files on a file host and not even have a website. You can have a website and also host on a podcast host. You can run it to iTunes. You can run it to Android podcasting services. You can run it to all these things, right? But today, I'm really going to teach you, number one, how to set it up on WordPress. Number two, where to host your files. And number three, how to make it all work and go to iTunes. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so this first step can be a little confusing. But essentially you need somewhere to host your podcast files. Podcast files, because they're audio, some of them are video, they're pretty big. And you don't want to host them on your website or anywhere like that because it'll take up a lot of your space on your server. And you just don't want any part of that. Plus, if your website goes down, it could take your files down. And it's just a big mess. You need somewhere to host your site or host your files, So Blueberry, I don't know, is the one that we have used for our podcast since its inception in 2015. There are also others like Libsyn and SoundCloud that you can use. And let's say you didn't have a website. Maybe you wanted to launch your podcast before you had a website, or you didn't plan to have a website. You always wanted just a podcast and no site. You can entirely host your podcast on a site like Blueberry or Libsyn or SoundCloud and make everything come from here and not really have a website or have these other steps that I'm going to show you. Okay? But for the most part, it is recommended for you to have a website because, number one, you are going to increase the SEO and the reach of your podcast with a website by putting the written text notes and titles of your podcast episodes out into the interwebs and out into Google. It's also recommended because it just looks better, and you can give people direct links to your episodes or your website easier and things like that. So, but I do want to say that's the confusing part. If you did want to host a podcast without having a website, totally doable. The basically exact same way you would do it with a website, except for the next steps I'm going to show you. And then that's it. So I'm actually going to show you 2 or 3 other steps here, and that's going to be setting up your website for the podcast, setting up your feed for the podcast, and then submitting to iTunes. If you're not going to have a website, you can basically do all of that from within your dashboard in Blueberry, Libsyn, or SoundCloud. So you can basically skip all that and just do a quick Google search of whatever platform you're using and see how to submit your podcast to iTunes. Again, I recommend, and pretty well anybody's going to recommend, that you actually have a website where the podcast episodes live. So that's what I'm showing you. I'm also showing you everything on WordPress, but it's very, very, very similar if you're using Blogger or Squarespace or any other website platform. But I'm going to show you on WordPress, so there's going to be some things like plugins that you'll use, etc. Going back, you do need somewhere to host the files, and I'm going to recommend Blueberry. I will put a link to everything I'm referencing below the YouTube video and in the blog post, so you can make sure that you are able to find them there. Once you're here, you'll just set up an account, and then it'll ask you where your feed is coming from, essentially. And that's what I'm going to show you next. Okay, so step number 2, you have somewhere to host your files. Step number 2, you actually need to design your cover art. So we actually did our cover art in Photoshop, but you could do this in Canva or really anywhere. It does need to be a square. This one is 1200 by 1200, which I believe is the recommended size. And then just remember that on iTunes, it shrinks way down. So your text needs to be a little bigger and things like that. But you can just do 1200 by 1200 image, and that is what goes on to iTunes. So number 1, find somewhere to host your files. Number 2, design your cover art. Number 3, you want to actually go in and set up your website as a host for these files and as a way for iTunes to pull them. Okay, so if you're using WordPress and if you're using Blueberry to host, Libsyn has a different one. You'll just need to do some quick Google research for that. But if you're using Blueberry and WordPress, you'll want to install the Blueberry PowerPress plugin. This will basically just make things easier for you, but it will also allow you to put in the audio files that will be hosted on Blueberry straight into the post. So on WordPress, you literally want to go in and add a new post. Every time you publish a podcast episode, it'll have a post that goes with it. So the title that you place here will be the title of the podcast episode in iTunes. The copy that you put here will be the show notes for the podcast episodes in iTunes. And then you will scroll down until you find the Blueberry section here, and you will actually go ahead and click this button and link it to a file hosted on Blueberry. So again, I have no clue if I'm saying that right, but essentially that's really all there is to it. You put in your title. This is the title that it will show up on iTunes with. The show notes will be here, will be whatever's there, and then you'll hook it to the right episode. So each post, iTunes will know once we're done with this process to come into your website, search for whatever tag you tell it that the podcast will be tagged with, which I'm going to go over that in a second. And then it will look for the title, the show notes, and the actual media file. And then that's really it. So each podcast episode will be its own blog post, essentially. So it could be your only blog post. People like Amy Porterfield do that. She doesn't do blog posts. All of her blog posts are just extensive show notes for her podcast episodes. On this particular website, on our podcast website, all of our blog posts are just podcast episodes. But you could, if you wanted to do it on your own site where you already have a blog, you can do that. And the next thing is what I'm going to show you will differentiate what goes to iTunes and what doesn't. Okay, so on WordPress and really any other platform you're using, you'll want to choose a tag or a category that iTunes is going to know means there's a new podcast. So let's go here and we could say, let's say I had like 14 categories. And I had like guests and tips and tricks and tech and systems and all these things. You only need one category that's for the podcast. So most people are going to create a category called podcast. You could, of course, name it something different. It's just really easy to name it podcast and then use that. So you'll check this box when you're publishing a post that you want to go to iTunes that has a media file attached, that has a title and show notes. You will check the box that says podcast or whatever else you determine to be your tag for your podcast. Now in WordPress, I can add a new category straight from here. So if you're looking at this and you don't have any yet, you can add one right here. Now, if I published this with the audio file attached and the title and the show notes, but I did not check podcast and hit publish, it would not get pushed to iTunes because I have iTunes basically alerted that this is the tag that I'm using for anything that needs to be submitted to their platform. So pick a tag, doesn't matter what it is. Easiest one would be podcast, and click it on every one that you're publishing. Once you have created a title, put in show notes, hooked it to a file, and clicked the correct tag for you or category, in my case it would be podcast, you hit publish. Now, you can do that prior to submitting to iTunes and all of that. But if I just did this right now as step number 3, I guess, it wouldn't go anywhere. It would just be on my website. So now we need to go in and tell it to go to iTunes. This part can get a little tricky, which, again, if you're just hosting it on like SoundCloud or Blueberry or Libsyn or whatever, this part is non-existent, and as well as this part. Everything is done in that platform. But if you're doing it on a website, then you definitely need these next steps. You actually need to put your feed somewhere. And I know that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but you need to have a feed set up for your podcast posts. And this is easiest done at a website called feedburner.google.com. Okay. I think you can actually even just go to feedburner.com. Feedburner.google.com. Now you'll have to log in with your Google email address and set up an account. But essentially, this is the stuff you set up initially. You have the name of your feed title. This is what will go into iTunes as your podcast name. The original feed. All right. So if you are on WordPress, your feed will be your URL. So allupinyourladybusiness.com/category or tag, whatever you used, but I do recommend a category like I just showed you, /that category name, /feed. Okay. And I'm going to include that in the show notes. I'm talking about podcasts in the iTunes. Oh my goodness, y'all. I'm going to include it in the description box below the YouTube video and in the blog post. But that's if you're on WordPress. If you're using another site like Squarespace or something like that, just do a quick Google, what is my podcast feed? And it will come up. But it's going to be something similar. So again, your URL /category /podcast, if that's the category you named, /feed. Okay. Now, if you knew that your website would never have another post on it that wasn't for the podcast, you could just set this up to be directly to the feed itself and not have the category and podcast in there. But I do recommend doing it this way so you don't have any confusion if you in the future. So anyway, you'll put that in when you're setting up FeedBurner, and then you'll set a FeedBurner address. So it'll be feeds.feedburner.com /something. And for us, it's all up in your lady business, which was really easy. Now, this is all in the initial setup. Then what you will do, you will actually go to the Optimize tab and go to SmartCast. You will likely have to activate this because that's why there's check marks next to some and not others. But you'll see here it's for podcasting and iTunes settings. You can actually change everything with iTunes here. So if you ever need to change your cover art or the title of your podcast or the description of your podcast or anything, it will be set up here. Now you'll also want to go in and do title and description burner here. But I'm going to click on SmartCast. And this is where you put what category and what subcategory your podcast will be in. This is where you will upload the image for your podcast thumbnail. This is where you will upload the subtitle of your podcast and the podcast description. This is also where you will put in keywords for your podcast. So if someone goes into iTunes and searches for business or entrepreneurs, your podcast will be in that group of people. And you could also put in your email address if you wanted. Here is where you can tell iTunes whether you want the explicit rating or not. For us, we always leave this on throughout all episodes because that was a rule when we launched our podcast, is that all episodes had to be marked explicit or if there were cuss words in any other episodes. And honestly, we want our guests to be free to say shit if they want to, and it sometimes slips out of our mouths as well. So we always leave that on yes, but that means we have the big red E next to our name. So you can hit save there and all of your settings will be saved. So again, if you ever need to change your podcast cover art or the title of your podcast or the subtitle or whatever, this is where you'll do that. Now in the title and description burner, I actually misspoke a second ago. You can't change the title of your podcast from here. There's actually not a title there. But in the title and description burner, that's where you do the title and the description. Now, I leave this description the same as what's in the SmartCast under the podcast summary because I want it to match up so that if they're seeing a summary or description, it's the same thing. Now, so those are the two things you want to have active, the SmartCast and the title and description burner inside your feed burner account. Now, really quickly, the actual number. So if I go back to the analyze and it shows 1,080 subscribers, this is actually not an accurate number of subscribers. So you'll see here when I clicked on this that it says how it's calculated. So essentially that number is only the amount of active subscribers who have requested to listen to your podcast in the last 24 hours. Okay. So again, its FeedBurner subscriber count is based on an approximation of how many times your feed has been requested in a 24-hour period. This is not an exact number. I guarantee we have way more than 1,000 subscribers to our podcast. It's just that it's only active and people who have requested to pull the feed through iTunes and essentially through FeedBurner, because that's how we're going to submit in the last 24 hours. So you could log in today and it could be one number. You could log in 2 days from now and it have been tripled, and 3 days from then and it go back down. So don't let that number trip you up too much, because it isn't an accurate number and it is based on the last 24 hours. So it's a little annoying, which, what are you going to do? You can actually go to the last 30 days and see an average of your 24-hour subscribers. Again, not super accurate and not really something you need to pay attention to. Okay, so just to summarize really quickly, we found somewhere to host our podcast files. We made cover art. We decided on a tag and learned how to publish posts in our website. For us, it was WordPress. And then we put our feed into FeedBurner. Okay, now the very last thing you need to do is to submit it to iTunes. So what you need to do that is to go to podcastconnect.apple.com. And again, that's podcasts with an S, connect.apple.com. Now you'll have to sign in with your Apple ID, and then all you have to do is hit the plus here. Then it will ask you for the RSS feed. So you can put in the URL that is found right here. So for us, it's feeds.feedburner.com/all up in your lady business. That is what you'll put there, and you'll submit. You'll probably have to validate it first and then submit it. Now, it does take a couple of days, maybe even weeks, to get approved by iTunes, but then they'll send you a notification and it'll be active. Now, I want to address something. If you're in WordPress and you're using Blueberry and you're using WordPress and you're using the Blueberry PowerPress plugin, you can actually do everything we just did in FeedBurner through that plugin. So it's completely up to you how you do this, but I find that, what if we wanted to change hosts of our podcast? What if we wanted it to be coming from a different, if we wanted to switch to Libsyn or, SoundCloud or whatever? I want to be sending our feed through a third-party site to then be sent to iTunes so that I can change things like that if necessary. But you don't have to do that. You could easily come in to your PowerPress settings in your WordPress site and set everything up that we just set up in FeedBurner. So you can actually tell it, the feeds, how to take it to iTunes. And actually, I change things in here, but because it's not feeding from here, it doesn't change anything in iTunes. So that's really it, guys. I know it sounds complicated, but you literally have to do it one time. And then every time that you publish a podcast episode, again, just go in, create a new post, give it the title you want, give it the show notes you want, and hook it to the correct audio file. And then make sure you give it the category that iTunes is set up to receive, or FeedBurner is set up to receive. And that's it. And now your podcast is on iTunes, and every time you publish an episode, you just upload it into Blueberry and then do your WordPress stuff, and iTunes has got it. So let's say, just a quick troubleshooting tip, let's say something it published to iTunes and the title was wrong, or like the description was wrong, or maybe the audio file didn't work. You'll only have to change things in Blueberry if it's the audio file, and then everything else is changed in WordPress. So if the title of the episode is wrong, it's because the title of your post is wrong. If the show notes are not there, it's because the show notes aren't there in your post in WordPress. So that's really it. And setting up a podcast doesn't have to be hard. It's actually really easy. And I hope that helps you guys. Also, make sure you stick around and subscribe to my YouTube channel here at Hey Jessica, and click the link below if you're on the YouTube channel, or above or below if you're on the blog post, and grab the ultimate checklist for starting a podcast. And that way you've got all of this at your fingertips as you're getting started. So I hope that helps. Bye, y'all.